Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where hope flickers like a dying star and war consumes entire civilizations in the span of a heartbeat, there exists a force unlike any other. Not the calculated cruelty of chaos, nor the cold efficiency of the Necrons, nor even the desperate fanaticism of humanity's Imperium. No, this force is something far more primal, far more terrifying in its simplicity. It is the endless, inexorable tide of green-skinned warriors who know nothing but conflict and desire nothing but the next fight. They are the Orks, and they are everywhere. To understand who the Orks truly fight, we must first understand what they are. Picture, if you will, a species that should not exist. A biological impossibility that combines the characteristics of animals and fungi, yet creating beings that reproduce through spores released from their bodies. Imagine warriors who can survive wounds that would kill any other creature, whose crude weapons function through nothing more than collective belief, and whose entire civilization exists for the singular purpose of war. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. The Orks were designed, genetically engineered millions of years ago, to be the perfect soldiers. And in that perfection lies a terrible truth. They have no natural enemy because they were made to fight everyone, everything, always. The question of who the Orks truly fight against seems simple on the surface. They fight everyone. The answer appears obvious, almost trivial. But this simplicity masks a deeper complexity, a fascinating tapestry of conflicts that reveals not just who the Orks battle, but why they exist at all. Some enemies represent ancient purposes, debts written into their very genetic code. Others are targets of opportunity, civilizations unfortunate enough to draw the attention of a green tide. And some, perhaps most frighteningly, are enemies the Orks have created for themselves through the very nature of what they are. Walk through any battlefield where the Orks have fought, and you will see the aftermath of their particular brand of warfare. Crude fortifications constructed from salvaged metal and faith. Weapons that function through psychic gestalt rather than proper engineering. Bodies, so many bodies, green and otherwise, scattered like leaves after a storm. The Orks leave no world unchanged. They cannot. War is not something they do. War is what they are. It flows through them like blood. They're essential and inescapable. Their origins stretch back to a time before humanity even dreamed of reaching the stars, to an epoch when the galaxy was young and gods walked between the stars. The Old Ones, those mysterious and powerful beings who shaped so much of what would come after, created the Orks' ancestors for a specific purpose. They called them the Krork, and they were weapons in the truest sense. Massive beings, reaching nearly 12 meters tall, wearing armor that would make even the mighty space marines of the current age seem primitive. These ancient Krork were created to fight in the war in heaven, that most terrible of all conflicts, against enemies whose power we can barely comprehend today. But the Old Ones are long gone. Their great civilization collapsed and scattered. The Krork devolved, or perhaps evolved, into the Orks we know in the 41st Millennium. Smaller than their ancestors, cruder in many ways, but no less dangerous. In fact, perhaps more dangerous for their very adaptability and resilience. Where the Krork served a purpose in a specific war, the Orks have become a perpetual engine of conflict, self-sustaining and impossible to truly eliminate. Their biology ensures their persistence. Kill an Ork, and spores release from its body. Leave those spores unchecked, and within weeks or months, new Orks will grow, along with their lesser cousins, the Gretchen and Snotlings, and the Squigs that serve as everything from food to weapons to companions. Purge a world of Orks through overwhelming force and miss even a single spore, and the infestation will return. The only certain method is complete destruction, is burning worlds down to bedrock and leaving nothing but ash and radiation. And even then, sometimes the spores survive. This resilience, this absolute refusal to be destroyed, means the Orks have persisted through every epoch of galactic history. They fought in the War in Heaven. They battled humanity during its dark age of technology, long before the Imperium existed. They survived the Age of Strife, while more advanced civilizations collapsed. They endure the horrors of the 41st Millennium, with the same simple philosophy they have always had. Find a fight, have a good scrap, and if you win, find another fight. But who do they fight? Against whom do these green-skinned warriors pit themselves? The answer reveals layers upon layers of conflict, ancient grudges and new enmities, battles born of design and wars of pure circumstance. Some enemies the Orks seek out deliberately, drawn by instinct or purpose. Others find themselves targeted simply because they exist, because they possess something the Orks want, or because they were unfortunate enough to be noticed. There are the Necrons, those ancient machines of living metal, who remember when the Orks were called Krork and stood as soldiers of the Old Ones. There is the Imperium of man, that vast and crumbling empire of humanity, which has fought the Orks for 10,000 years across countless worlds. There are the Tyranids, those extragalactic horrors that devour all biomass in their path, creating a conflict where two species, perfectly designed for war, meet in battles of unimaginable scale. There is Chaos, that ever-present corruption that seeks to twist all things to the service of dark gods, though the Orks resist it in ways few other species can. There are the Eldar, that dying race of ancient power, who have fought the Orks since before humanity learned to shape stone. And then, perhaps most tellingly, there are the Orks themselves. For all their unity in the face of external threats, the green-skinned warriors spend as much time fighting each other as they do battling other races. Tribal conflicts, tests of strength, simple boredom, all lead to Ork fighting Ork in an endless cycle of violence that both weakens and strengthens them in equal measure. Each of these enemies represents something different in the complex ecosystem of war that the Orks inhabit. Each conflict tells us something about the nature of these green-skinned warriors, about their strengths and weaknesses, or about what drives them and what they ultimately seek. Understanding who the Orks fight is, in many ways, understanding what the Orks are. Not just warriors, not just monsters, but something far more complex and far more terrifying. So join me now as we explore these conflicts, these enemies, these endless wars that define the Orks and shape the galaxy itself. We will walk battlefields ancient and new, witness conflicts that span millennia and battles that last mere hours. We will see the Orks at their most cunning and their most brutal, their most united and their most fractured. And through it all, we will begin to understand a simple, terrible truth. The Orks have no true enemy because they are the enemy of everything, including themselves. Their existence is conflict. Their purpose is war. And in the grim darkness of the far future, as that makes them perhaps the most dangerous force in all the galaxy, the ancient purpose, Necrons and the War in Heaven. To understand the oldest enemy of the Orks, we must travel back in time, not hundreds or even thousands of years, but millions upon millions of years, to an age when the galaxy looked nothing like it does in the 41st millennium. This was the time of the War in Heaven, a conflict so vast and so terrible that its aftershocks still ripple through reality itself. And at the heart of this war, as soldiers and weapons, were the ancestors of the Orks. The War in Heaven began as a conflict between two ancient races, the Old Ones and the Necrontire. The Old Ones were beings of immense psychic power, masters of the warp and creators of countless servant species. They had achieved a kind of immortality, living for eons while they shaped the galaxy to their designs. The Necrontire, by contrast, were a race cursed with brief, painful lives. Their homestar's radiation poisoned them from birth, ensuring that even their leaders rarely lived more than a few decades. When the Necrontyr begged the Old Ones to share the secret of eternal life, they were refused. That refusal sparked a war that would consume the entire galaxy. At first, the Necrontyre had numbers and technology on their side. They had conquered much of the galaxy, their dynasties spreading across countless star systems. But the Old Ones had something more powerful: the Webway, a network of tunnels through reality itself that allowed them to move armies and fleets instantaneously across vast distances. Every time the Necrontyre seemed poised to win, the Old Ones would retreat through the Webway, strike from unexpected angles, and wear down their enemies through superior mobility and tactics. The Necrontyre were being beaten back, pushed to the edges of the galaxy, their great empire crumbling under the weight of an enemy they could not catch and could not defeat. Then everything changed. The Necrontyre discovered, or were discovered by, the Satan, the star gods. These were entities of pure energy, living in the hearts of stars, ancient and powerful beyond mortal comprehension. The Satan, for reasons of their own, offered the Necrontyre a deal: eternal life in exchange for their service. The Necrontyre, desperate and dying, accepted. They underwent biotransference, a process that ripped their souls from their bodies and placed their consciousnesses into bodies of living metal. But they became the Necrons, soulless and immortal, no longer alive in any traditional sense, but granted the power to finally strike back against the Old Ones. The tide of the war turned. The Necrons, led by their Citan masters, began to win. They developed technology to breach the Webway itself. They created weapons that could extinguish stars and shatter planets. Systems died. Entire sectors were consumed by black holes or bathed in killing radiation. The Old Ones, for all their power and knowledge, were being pushed back. Their servants, their subject races, were dying by the billions. And in their desperation, the Old Ones made a fateful decision. They would create new races, new weapons, species specifically designed to fight the Necrons and the Satan. This is where the Orks enter our story, though they were not called Orks then. They were the Croc, and they were magnificent. Standing nearly 12 meters tall, they wore sophisticated armor and carried weapons that would have been the envy of any modern military force. They were not the crude, simple warriors we know today. The Croc were intelligent, organized, devastating in their application of force. They were living weapons in the most literal sense, each one a perfect soldier designed for a specific purpose: to kill Necrons. Alongside the Croc, the Old Ones created or uplifted other races. The Eldar, with their strong connection to the warp, could use psychic powers that were anathema to the Satan. The Jokairo and the Hrud and countless others, each designed or modified to serve in the war effort. But of all these warrior races, the Croc may have been the most successful at their intended purpose. And they fought the Necrons across countless battlefields, their massive forms standing against legions of living metal, their weapons designed specifically to overcome Necron resilience and regeneration. The war in heaven raged for what must have been millennia. Entire species were created and destroyed. The warp itself began to change, corrupted by the psychic emanations of trillions of dying souls. New entities formed in that roiling sea of emotion and thought, entities that would one day become the chaos gods we know in the current age. The galaxy was being torn apart by forces so powerful that reality itself buckled under the strain. Then, at what should have been the moment of their final victory, the Satan made a mistake. Arrogant in their power and confident in their dominance, they underestimated their servants. The Silent King, Amsarek, who led the Necrons, had watched as the Satan grew fat on the souls of his people, had seen his entire race transformed into soulless machines, and he had waited, bided his time, prepared for the moment when the Satan would be most vulnerable. When the Old Ones were finally defeated, when the last of their great strongholds had fallen, Zarek struck. The Necrons rose against their gods. Using weapons of terrible power, they shattered the Satan, breaking them into countless shards that could be contained and controlled. The star gods, seemingly invincible, were defeated by their own servants. But the victory was hollow. The Necrons were weakened by their rebellion, their numbers depleted by eons of war. The warp had become a hellscape of enslavers and nascent chaos entities. The galaxy was dying, and consumed by conflict and corruption. Zarek looked upon what remained and made a decision that would shape the next 60 million years of galactic history. The Necrons would sleep. They would enter their tomb worlds, vast underground complexes, and wait out the coming storm. When they awoke, the galaxy would be different. The Eldar would rise and fall. Humanity would emerge and create its own empire. And the Krork would devolve into the Orks, their sophistication lost, their purpose forgotten, but their fundamental nature as warriors remaining intact. And so the Necrons slept, and the galaxy changed around them. The Eldar inherited the mantle of dominance, building an empire that spanned the galaxy and lasted for millions of years. The Krork, without the old ones to guide them, began to change. They grew smaller, cruder. Their technology became less sophisticated, more reliant on their psychic gestalt field than on actual engineering. They forgot their purpose, their original design. But they remained warriors. They remained dangerous. They remained Orks. Fast forward to the 41st millennium, and the Necrons are awakening. Slowly, gradually, tomb worlds across the galaxy are coming back to life. Ancient dynasts emerge from their 60 million year sleep to find a galaxy they barely recognize. And when these awakening Necrons encounter the Orks, there is a recognition, a memory written in their programming, in whatever remains of their consciousness. These green-skinned barbarians are the devolved remnants of the Krork, the enemies they fought so long ago. The conflicts between Orks and Necrons in the current era have a particular character and a specific flavor of ancient grudge mixed with new circumstances. The Necrons remember what the Orks' ancestors were capable of. They know that these seemingly simple creatures carry within them the genetic legacy of warriors who once stood against the might of the Satan themselves. And this knowledge makes them cautious, respectful even, of the threat the Orks represent. For their part, the Orks have no conscious memory of the war in heaven. They do not remember their origins as the Krork, do not recall the purpose for which they were designed. But somewhere in their genetic memory, in the coded instincts that guide their behavior, there is a recognition. The Necrons are good enemies. They are tough. They fight back. They provide the kind of challenge that makes for a proper scrap. When Orks encounter Necrons, they do not see ancient enemies or remember old wars. They see walking metal men who refuse to stay down, who keep coming back even after being blown apart, who present exactly the kind of fight that the Orks were designed to enjoy. The battles between Orks and Necrons in the modern age range from small skirmishes to massive campaigns. A Necron tomb world awakens to find its surface infested with Orks who arrived decades or centuries ago and have been fighting amongst themselves in the interim, gradually growing larger and more numerous. The Necrons must fight not to conquer, but simply to clear their own territory. An Ork crusade crashes into a Necron dynasty's borders, drawn by tales of tough enemies and good fighting. The result is a grinding conflict where neither side can truly destroy the other, both the Necrons constantly regenerating while new Orks are drawn to the battle by the psychic call of the green tide. What makes these conflicts particularly interesting is how well matched the two species are, despite their vastly different approaches to war. The Necrons have superior technology, weapons that can unmake matter at the molecular level, vehicles that phase in and out of reality, soldiers who can repair themselves from catastrophic damage. But the Orks have numbers, resilience, and an adaptability that comes from their unique biology and psychic field. A Necron warrior might destroy a dozen Orks before being overwhelmed, but those dozen Orks will be replaced by new warriors grown from spores, while the Necron's tomb world resources are finite. There is also a philosophical opposition at play. The Necrons represent ultimate order, a perfect control, immortality through technology, and the eradication of all organic life. The Orks represent chaos, not chaos in the warp sense, but the chaos of uncontrolled growth, of life spreading and consuming and fighting simply because that is what it does. The Necrons seek to reclaim a galaxy they once ruled, to restore the order of ancient dynasties and the perfection of their pre-biotransference empire. The Orks seek nothing but the next fight, the next war, the endless cycle of conflict that is their reason for being. In many ways, the Necrons are the perfect enemy for the Orks, the enemy they were designed to fight. They are tough enough to provide a real challenge. They have technology and weapons that make each battle interesting. They regenerate, ensuring that the fight continues even after what should be fatal wounds. And they are spread across the entire galaxy, ensuring that Orks can find them anywhere, anytime they want a good scrap. But here is the terrible irony. The Orks do not recognize the Necrons as their true purpose, their original enemy. They do not wake up each day thinking about the ancient debt written into their genes, the design purpose encoded in their DNA. They fight the Necrons for the same reason they fight everyone else. Because the Necrons are there. Because they fight back. Because the conflict itself is its own reward. The Necrons, however, remember. They remember the Krork. They remember what the Orks could be if they were to regain even a fraction of their ancestors' sophistication and power. And this memory terrifies them in a way few other threats can. Because the Necrons know something that most other races do not. If the Orks were ever to truly unite, if they were ever to reclaim their heritage as the Krork, they would be unstoppable. They would be what the Old Ones designed them to be, a weapon capable of destroying the Necrons themselves. This ancient conflict, this war that began before most current races even existed, continues in the 41st millennium. Every battle between Ork and Necron is an echo of that ancient war in heaven, a continuation of a grudge so old that one side has forgotten it ever existed. The Necrons fight to prevent the Orks from becoming what they once were. The Orks fight because fighting is what they do, and the galaxy burns in the wake of their eternal conflict. It's the eternal conflict, the Imperium of man. If the Necrons represent the Orks' ancient purpose, the Imperium of man represents their most frequent enemy, the civilization they have clashed with more than any other in the current age. For 10,000 years, humanity and the Orks have fought across countless worlds, in battles ranging from small border skirmishes to system-spanning wars that have cost billions of lives on both sides. Understanding this conflict is essential to understanding the Orks themselves, for in many ways, it is humanity that has given the Orks their greatest challenges and their most legendary victories. The Imperium of man is vast, spanning roughly 1 million worlds across the galaxy, home to untold trillions of human beings living under the nominal rule of the God Emperor of mankind. This is not a unified empire in any real sense. It is a patchwork of different cultures, different levels of technology, different interpretations of the imperial creed, held together by a combination of faith, fear, and the absolute necessity of cooperation against the countless threats that beset humanity from all sides. The Imperium is simultaneously the most powerful and the most vulnerable empire in the galaxy, strong enough to field armies that can conquer entire sectors, but spread so thin that any major threat can punch through its defenses and wreak havoc before being contained. This is why the Orks find humanity such appealing targets. The Imperium is everywhere, which means Orks can find humans to fight almost anywhere they look. Humanity has countless planets, which means plenty of targets for raiding and conquest. Human worlds often have good defenses, which means good fights. And humanity has a particular quality that makes them especially interesting to the Orks. They never give up, never truly surrender, even in the face of overwhelming force. This stubbornness, this refusal to accept defeat, makes humans worthy opponents in a way that many other races are not. The conflict between Orks and humans stretches back further than the Imperium itself. During humanity's dark age of technology, when humans first spread across the stars using advanced technology, we can barely comprehend today, they encountered the Orks. Legend says that the first meeting between an orc and a human occurred on some forgotten, airless world. Two warriors from different species meeting face to face for the first time. And according to that legend, that they immediately tried to kill each other. This pattern would repeat itself countless times over the millennia that followed. When the Age of Strife came and humanity's empire collapsed, when the warp became too dangerous for travel and human worlds were isolated from each other for thousands of years, the Orks flourished. Without the centralized human empire to oppose them, Orc warlords carved out territories across human space. Many human worlds fell to Orc invasions during this dark age, their populations enslaved or killed, their infrastructure repurposed for the crude but effective Orc war machine. Then came the Emperor of Mankind and his Great Crusade. 30,000 years ago, the Emperor emerged from Terra, the birth world of humanity, with a vision of reuniting all of humanity under one banner. He created the Space Marines, the Primarchs, and the vast armies of the Imperial military. And one of the Great Crusade's primary objectives was the elimination of the Orc threat from human space. Thousands of campaigns were fought. Millions of Orcs were killed. Entire Orc empires were dismantled, their worlds burned clean, their populations scattered or destroyed. The most famous of these early campaigns was the Ullanor Crusade. Ullanor was the capital of a massive Orc empire, the largest concentration of greenskins ever seen up to that point. The Orc warlord who ruled it, Orlak Urg, commanded billions of Orcs spread across dozens of worlds. When the emperor learned of Ullanor, he knew it had to be destroyed, not just defeated, not just contained, but completely and utterly eradicated. He deployed 3 full Space Marine legions. Along with their Primarchs and vast numbers of Imperial army troops, the Lunar Wolves under Horus, the Blood Angels under Sanguinius, the White Scars under Jagatai Khan. These were the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, led by the Emperor's own genetically engineered sons. The Ullanor Crusade was brutal, a grinding campaign that lasted months and cost hundreds of thousands of Imperial lives. But in the end, Horus himself killed Orlak Urg in single combat, throwing the Orc warlord's broken body from the battlements of his own fortress. The sight of their leader's corpse sent panic through the Orc ranks, and what had been an organized defense became a rout. The Imperium won a decisive victory, shattering the largest Orc empire in the galaxy and demonstrating that humanity could stand against the green tide and emerge victorious. Whilst the Emperor was so pleased with this victory that he named Horus War Master, giving him command of the entire Great Crusade. The ceremony was held on Ullanor itself, on the world that represented humanity's triumph over the Orc threat. It should have been a moment of pure victory, a turning point where the Imperium secured its future and eliminated one of its greatest enemies. Instead, it sowed the seeds of the Horus heresy, the civil war that would nearly destroy the Imperium and forever change the course of human history. Horus's elevation to War Master created jealousy among his brothers, began a chain of events that would end with half the Primarchs falling to chaos and Terra itself coming under siege. But even as humanity tore itself apart in civil war, the Orcs remained. They rebuilt, they spread. And new warlords rose to take the place of those who had fallen, because that is what Orcs do. They persist, they endure. They cannot be permanently defeated because their very biology ensures their survival. Kill every Orc on a world, and their spores will grow new ones. Exterminate an Orc empire, and its scattered survivors will establish new territories elsewhere. The Orcs are less an enemy that can be beaten, and more a force of nature that must be constantly managed, constantly fought, constantly held in check. The current era has seen some of the largest and most destructive Orc invasions in Imperial history. None exemplifies this better than the career of Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the self-proclaimed prophet of the Orc gods, Gork and Mork. and the greatest Ork warlord since the War of the Beast. Ghazghkul's story, which we will explore in more depth later, is one of cunning, vision, and an understanding of war that goes beyond what most people expect from an Ork. He has fought the Imperium not once, but twice on the world of Armageddon, each time coming close to claiming victory against overwhelming odds. Armageddon is a hive world in Segmentum Solar, relatively close to Terra itself, a planet of immense strategic importance. It is home to billions of humans and vast industrial capacity. Its loss would be a catastrophic blow to the Imperium. When Ghazghkul first invaded Armageddon, in what became known as the Second War for Armageddon, he demonstrated a level of strategic thinking rarely seen in Ork commanders. He used diversionary attacks, feints, coordinated assaults across multiple fronts. His forces nearly overwhelmed the planet's defenders, despite being outnumbered and facing some of the Imperium's finest troops, including the Space Marines of several chapters. The conflict was eventually decided by the arrival of massive Imperial reinforcements and the legendary leadership of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, a human who earned the Orks' respect through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. Yarrick became Ghazghkul's rival and, in a strange way, his friend. The Ork warlord respected Yarrick as a worthy opponent, someone who understood war the way Ghazghkul did. When Ghazghkul eventually retreated from Armageddon, it was not in defeat, but in preparation for his return. 57 years later, to the day, Ghazghkul came back. The Third War for Armageddon was even larger than the second, with over 2,000 Ork ships and multiple space hulks entering the system. It was the largest green tide ever assembled, drawn from multiple Ork empires and unified under Ghazghkul's banner. The Imperium responded with portions of over 25 Space Marine chapters, dozens of Imperial Guard regiments, and multiple Titan legions. The war became a grinding stalemate, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, the planet itself being torn apart by the intensity of the fighting. But here is what made the Third War for Armageddon truly significant. Ghazghkul eventually left, not because he was beaten, not because the Imperium had won, but because his visions from Gork and Mork told him he had a greater purpose. He was to unite all Orks, to gather the greatest war call the galaxy had ever seen, and to drown the stars in an eternal conflict. Armageddon was just one battle in a larger war, one fight in an endless campaign. This is what makes the Ork-Imperium conflict so dangerous for humanity. The Imperium fights for survival, for the preservation of its worlds and the protection of its people. Every battle lost is a tragedy. Every world that falls is a strategic catastrophe. But the Orks fight because fighting is what they do. They do not need to win every battle. They do not need to hold territory or protect resources. They simply need to fight, and in fighting, they grow stronger, attract more of their kind, and become an ever greater threat. The War of the Beast, which occurred in the early 32nd millennium, roughly 1500 years after the Horus Heresy, demonstrated just how dangerous a truly unified Ork force could be.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer for quite a while, and I have to say, the Orks are probably my favorite faction to research. Not because they're the most complex or the most tragic, but because they're just so refreshingly honest about what they are. Every other faction has these grand justifications for their violence. The Imperium fights for humanity's survival, the Eldar fight to avoid extinction, but the Orks, they just fight because it's Tuesday. There's something almost admirable about that. Even if that purpose is just really enjoying a good scrap, it makes them terrifying enemies, but also in a weird way the most content species in the galaxy. But yeah, let's go back to the subject.
A warlord known only as the Beast united the Ork race to a degree not seen since the War in Heaven. The resulting green tide nearly destroyed the Imperium. Attack moons, massive Ork constructs the size of small planets, appeared in orbit around Imperial worlds. Terra itself came under threat. Multiple entire Space Marine chapters were wiped out. The Imperium's leadership was thrown into chaos. Only through massive sacrifice and the coordinated efforts of the remaining Space Marine chapters was the threat finally eliminated. The Beast himself was eventually killed, but the cost was staggering, and the Imperium learned a terrible lesson. If the Orks were ever to truly unite, if they were ever to put aside their tribal conflicts and internecine warfare and focus their full might on a single enemy, they could destroy the Imperium. The only thing that saves humanity from this fate is the Orks' tendency to fight amongst themselves as much as they fight external enemies. The conflict between the Imperium and the Orks is not just military, it is ideological. The Imperium represents order, however brutal and oppressive that order might be. It represents civilization, progress, the idea that humanity has a manifest destiny among the stars. The Orks represent chaos in its purest form, not the chaos of the warp, but the chaos of entropy, of civilization's destruction, of order giving way to violence and conflict. When an Ork horde descends upon an imperial world, they are not just killing people and destroying infrastructure, they are undoing everything that world represented. Centuries of development, of culture, of human achievement, all swept away in a tide of green violence. And yet, paradoxically, the Imperium needs the Orks in a strange way. The eternal conflict against the Greenskins gives the Imperium purpose, provides a clear enemy that all humans can unite against. The Orks are simple to understand, easy to hate, satisfying to fight. They do not corrupt with honeyed words like chaos. They do not present difficult moral questions like the Tau. They are just enemies, clear and simple, who can be killed without hesitation or regret. In the grim darkness of the far future, such moral clarity is a rare and valuable thing. The battle between humanity and the Orks continues across 1,000,000 worlds, in 1,000 different forms. On some worlds, it is a desperate last stand, a doomed garrison making their final prayers as the green tide crashes against their walls. On others, it is a grinding campaign of attrition, Imperial Guard regiments slowly pushing back Ork territories at terrible cost. On still others, it is a Space Marine strike force executing a decapitation assault, killing an Ork warlord and watching his army collapse into infighting. But no matter the form it takes, no matter the scale or location, the conflict continues. It has continued for 10,000 years. It will likely continue for 10,000 more, because the Orks and humanity are locked in an eternal dance, neither able to truly destroy the other, in both committed to the fight for their own reasons. Humanity fights for survival, for the preservation of their species and their empire. The Orks fight because fighting is what they are, what they were designed to be, what they will always be. And in the end, that might be the most terrifying thing about the Orks. They do not need to win to succeed. They simply need to fight. And as long as the Imperium exists, as long as humanity spreads across the stars, there will always be something for the Orks to fight. The war will never end. It cannot end. It is eternal, like the Orks themselves. The biological nightmare, Tyranids and the Octarius War. If the Imperium represents the Orks' most frequent enemy, and the Necrons their ancient purpose, the Tyranids represent something else entirely, a mirror. The Great Devourer, as they are known, are an extragalactic species that consumes all biological matter in its path, stripping worlds down to bedrock before moving on to the next target. They are a hive mind of almost incomprehensible scale, operating with a single purpose: consume, adapt, grow stronger. And when they encountered the Orks, something remarkable happened. Two species, both designed for endless conflict, both capable of rapid adaptation and growth, met in a war that neither could truly win, and neither would ever want to end. The Tyranids entered our galaxy from the void between galaxies, drawn by some signal or attraction we still do not fully understand. They came in fleets so vast that they blotted out the stars, in numbers so great that all the military forces in the galaxy combined could not hope to match them. Their first encounters with Imperial forces were catastrophic for humanity. Entire worlds were consumed in weeks or months, their populations rendered down into biomass to fuel the Tyranid swarm's endless growth. The Xenos seemed unstoppable, adapting to every tactic used against them, evolving new forms to counter every weapon, learning and changing with each battle. As the Tyranid threat grew, the Imperium's defenders looked for any advantage, any weapon they could use against this new enemy. And one Inquisitor, a man named Cryptman, had what he thought was a brilliant idea. Use the galaxy's other great biological threat against the Tyranids. If the Orks and Tyranids could be made to fight each other, perhaps they would destroy themselves, saving the Imperium the trouble. It was ruthless, it was pragmatic, and it backfired spectacularly. Cryptman identified the perfect target for his plan. The Octarius Empire, one of the largest Ork empires in the galaxy, ruled by the Overfiend of Octarius, and containing billions of greenskins spread across dozens of worlds. If he could lure a Tyranid hive fleet to Octarius, the two forces would clash in a war of mutual annihilation. At least that was the theory. The reality proved to be far more complicated and far more terrifying. Cryptman and his Deathwatch teams captured a brood of Genestealers, the Tyranids' infiltration organisms, and seeded them on Ork worlds within the Octarius Empire. These Genestealers sent out their psychic beacon, calling to the hive fleets in the void. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest Tyranid fleet yet encountered, heard the call and altered its course. It descended upon the Octarius Empire like a living nightmare, its bioships darkening the skies, its ground forces emerging in waves of chitin and teeth. The Overfiend of Octarius, being an Ork, responded in the only way he knew, by gathering his boys and preparing for the best fight of his life. When the Tyranids landed on the first Ork worlds, they found not terrified populations fleeing in horror, but eager warriors charging forward with guns blazing and choppers raised. The Orks were thrilled. Finally, an enemy that would not run, that could not be intimidated, that would keep fighting no matter how many of them died. It was everything they had ever wanted in a war. The initial battles went poorly for the Orks. The Tyranids adapted quickly to greenskin tactics, developing new bioforms specifically designed to counter Ork strengths. And carnifexes with extra armor to resist Ork shooters, lictors that could ambush even the most cautious Ork war parties. Genestealers modified to better penetrate Ork hide. The Tyranids consumed world after world, their biomass growing with each Ork killed and processed. It seemed that Cryptman's plan was working. The Orks were being overwhelmed. But then something changed. The more the Orks fought, the bigger and stronger they got. This is one of the peculiar features of Ork biology. Combat stimulates their growth. An Ork that survives many battles will grow larger, tougher, meaner, and the Octarius War was providing more combat than any Ork could dream of. The Ork boys were growing into knobs. The knobs were approaching war boss size, and the war bosses were becoming living legends. Massive, green-skinned monsters who could tear Tyranid warriors apart with their bare hands. Moreover, the psychic field the Orks generate was growing stronger as more and more greenskins flocked to Octarius, drawn by the promise of the greatest fight in the galaxy. This gestalt field made their weapons work better, their vehicles run faster, their impossible technology actually function. As the Tyranids adapted to Ork tactics, the Orks were adapting right back, creating bigger guns, tougher armor, more devastating weapons. The result was a war that neither side could win, but neither would ever want to end. The Tyranids would surge forward, consuming Ork worlds and turning their biomass into new warriors. But those new warriors would face Orks, who were bigger and stronger than the last batch, or who had learned from previous battles and developed new tactics. The Orks would push back, reclaiming territories and scattering Tyranid swarms, only to face new waves of even more specialized bioforms designed to counter their latest innovations. The fighting spread across the entire Octarius sector. Worlds that had known nothing but Ork rule for generations suddenly became battlegrounds, where Green Tide met Xeno Swarm in conflicts of unimaginable scale. The skies rained with mycetic spores, deploying Tyranid warriors, while Ork rocks, crude spacecraft used for planetary assault, crashed down to deliver their own reinforcements. The ground shook with the footfalls of Tyranid biotitans and Ork gargants, massive war machines locked in titanic struggles, that could last for days. Cryptman's plan, meant to solve two problems at once, it had instead created a new nightmare. Because both species were growing stronger from the conflict, the Tyranids were evolving forms specifically adapted to fight Orks, gaining knowledge and biomass with each victory. The Orks were getting bigger, meaner, and more numerous as warriors from across the galaxy heard tales of the greatest scrap ever and came to join the fight. Instead of mutual destruction, Cryptman had created a breeding ground for superorganisms on both sides. The Imperium attempted to contain the conflict through the Cordon Impenetra, a network of fortified worlds and naval patrols designed to keep the war from spilling out into Imperial space. But maintaining this cordon required enormous resources and constant vigilance. And still, tendrils of the conflict escaped. Ork warbands, was grown massive and powerful from their fights in Octarius, would break through the cordon to raid nearby Imperial worlds. Tyranid splinter fleets, bloated with Ork biomass, would slip past the defenses to attack human colonies. Then Gazgkul Thraka arrived. The prophet of the Ork gods heard about the war in Octarius and decided it was too good to miss. He brought his own substantial forces to the sector and immediately began organizing the scattered Ork tribes into a more coherent fighting force. Under Gazgkul's leadership, the Orks began to push back against the Tyranids, reclaiming key worlds and stabilizing their defensive lines. The war, which had been trending toward a slow Tyranid victory, suddenly became a genuine stalemate. But Gazgkul did not stay long. His visions from Gork and Mork told him he had a greater purpose, as a larger war call to gather. After reorganizing the Ork forces and ensuring they could continue the fight without him, he departed Octarius with a massive fleet of 5 million warships, leaving behind an ongoing conflict that shows no signs of ending. The Octarius War continues to this day, a grinding stalemate where neither side can gain a decisive advantage. The Swarmlord, the Tyranid's greatest tactical organism, has personally led multiple campaigns to break the Ork resistance. Ork warlords of legendary size and power have emerged to lead their boys in desperate counterattacks. Entire worlds have been reduced to wastelands where nothing lives except Orks and Tyranids locked in eternal combat. What makes this conflict particularly terrifying for the rest of the galaxy is the question of what happens when it ends. If the Tyranids win, they will emerge bloated with biomass and genetic information harvested from one of the greatest warrior races in the galaxy. They will have evolved specific adaptations to fight any enemy, not just Orks. They will be stronger, more dangerous, more unstoppable than ever before, and they will turn that strength toward the rest of the galaxy. But if the Orks win, the result might be even worse. The Orks who emerge victorious from Octarius will be the largest, meanest, most battle-hardened greenskins in the galaxy. They will have fought and won against an enemy that nearly destroyed the Imperium multiple times. They will be confident, united, and looking for their next fight. And there are a lot of targets in the galaxy that would look very appealing to a massive Ork army fresh from its greatest victory. The worst-case scenario, and the most likely given current trends, is that neither side wins. The war simply continues, escalating endlessly as both species pour more resources into the conflict. The Octarius sector becomes a permanent war zone, a place where Ork and Tyranid clash for all eternity, growing stronger with each generation, evolving and adapting in an endless arms race where the only certainty is more violence and more death. This is what makes the Tyranids such a perfect enemy for the Orks, and such a terrifying threat to everyone else. They are as close to a biological mirror of the Orks as exists in the galaxy. They grow through conflict, they adapt to their enemies. They cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be deterred. They simply consume and move on. When Ork meets Tyranid, and it is the ultimate expression of war as natural force, two species perfectly designed for conflict, meeting in a battle that serves no higher purpose than the continuation of conflict itself. The Octarius War represents everything that is both magnificent and horrifying about the Orks. their joy in battle, their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, their ability to grow stronger through adversity. But it also represents the danger they pose, not just to their enemies, but to the galaxy itself. Because a species that grows stronger through conflict, when facing an enemy that also grows stronger through conflict, creates a feedback loop of escalating violence that can only end in catastrophe for everyone else. The Tyranids are the Orks' biological nightmare, their dark mirror, their perfect match. And the war between them is a glimpse of what the galaxy might become if the Orks were ever given free rein. An endless battlefield where nothing matters but the next fight, the next scrap, the next glorious moment of violence. It is the Orks' dream made manifest, and for everyone else, it is a preview of hell. The greatest paradox, Orks against themselves. Of all the enemies the Orks face, none is more constant, more predictable, or more fundamental to their nature than themselves. For every battle an Ork wages against the Imperium, against Tyranids, against Necrons or Eldar or Chaos, there are dozens of fights against other Orks. This might seem like a weakness, a fundamental flaw in their species that prevents them from achieving their full potential. And in many ways it is. But it is also integral to what makes them Orks, and to the very essence of their being. To understand this paradox is to understand the Orks themselves. Ork society, if you can call it that, is built entirely around a simple principle. Might makes right. The biggest, strongest Ork is in charge, period. There are no elections, no hereditary claims, no complex political structures. If you want to be boss, you find the current boss, and you beat him up. If you win, you are now the boss. If you lose, you are probably dead, and someone else will get a chance to try. This system is simple, brutal, and surprisingly effective at putting the most capable Orks in positions of leadership. But this system also ensures constant internal conflict, because there is always someone bigger trying to prove themselves, always an ambitious knob who thinks he could do better than the current boss, are always young boys looking to make their reputation. And the only way to prove yourself in Ork society is through violence. You cannot talk your way to the top. You cannot scheme or manipulate or form political alliances, at least not in any sophisticated sense. You fight, you win or lose, and your position in the hierarchy is determined accordingly. This means that even when no external enemies are present, Orks will fight each other. They will organize into tribes based on clan affiliation, the Goths preferring brutal close combat, the evil Suns obsessed with speed, the Bad Moons flaunting their wealth, the Blood Axes using tactics that other Orks consider downright un-Orky. These clans will raid each other, fight over territory, test each other's strength. Not because they hate each other, but because fighting is what they do, and it is what they are, and they need opponents regardless of where those opponents come from. When a particularly powerful warlord emerges, someone with the size and cunning to beat all the local bosses, they can unite multiple tribes under their banner. This creates what the Imperium calls a Great Crusade, though the Orks would simply call it a proper scrap. All the previously warring tribes put aside their differences and focus on external enemies, drawn together by the promise of good fights and worthwhile loot. These unified forces can be terrifyingly effective, capable of conquering entire sectors and threatening even heavily defended Imperial strongholds. But here is the problem. The unification never lasts. Eventually, the Great Crusade will run out of good enemies to fight. Maybe they conquer all the nearby planets. Maybe they suffer a major defeat that kills the warlord who united them. Maybe they just get bored because the fights are not as good as they hoped. Whatever the reason, when the external threat diminishes or the unifying leader falls, the Great Crusade fractures. The tribes that had worked together start fighting amongst themselves again. Ambitious bosses challenge for supremacy. The alliance collapses into infighting and civil war. This pattern has repeated itself countless times throughout Ork history. A great warlord rises, unites the tribes, conquers vast territories, and then dies or is defeated. The empire fragments. New warlords rise to fight over the scraps. Eventually, another great warlord emerges, and the cycle begins again. The Imperium has seen this pattern so many times that there are standard protocols for dealing with it. Assassinate the warlord if possible, survive the initial assault if assassination fails, and wait for the internal fighting to begin. The most famous example of this pattern is probably the Beast, that legendary Ork warlord who nearly destroyed the Imperium in the early 32nd millennium. The Beast united the Ork race to a degree not seen in millennia, coordinating multiple clans and warbands into a coherent fighting force that operated with strategic sophistication far beyond normal Ork capabilities. Attack moons appeared in orbit around Imperial worlds. Coordinated assaults struck across multiple sectors simultaneously. The Orks demonstrated tactics and organization that shocked Imperial commanders, who had grown used to greenskin hordes being relatively simple to predict and counter. When the Imperium finally killed the Beast, they did not do it through superior force or better tactics. They did it through assassination, through striking at the single point of failure that every Ork empire has, the boss. With the Beast dead, his great crusade collapsed almost immediately. The attack moons went silent. The coordinated assaults became scattered raids. The united front dissolved into tribal warfare as different bosses fought to claim the Beast's mantle. The Imperium was saved not by defeating the Orks, but by removing the one thing holding them together. This fundamental weakness has implications for how other species fight the Orks. Killing a warlord can end a crusade before it really begins. Disrupting Ork communications can prevent different tribes from coordinating. Creating divisions between clans can turn potential allies into enemies. The Eldar, in particular, have become masters of this, using subtle manipulation to turn Ork tribes against each other, ensuring that their violent energies are directed inward rather than at Eldar craft worlds. But here is the paradox. While this internal conflict weakens the Orks strategically, it also makes them stronger in other ways. Every fight an Ork survives, whether against another Ork or against external enemies, makes them bigger and tougher. The constant combat within Ork society ensures that only the strongest, most capable warriors survive to positions of leadership. An Ork boss has proven themselves not once, but hundreds or thousands of times, has survived countless challenges and emerged victorious from each one. When such a boss leads their boys into battle, they are not an untested commander, but a hardened veteran who has earned their position through violence and victory. Moreover, the internal competition drives innovation in a strange way. Ork mech boys are constantly trying to build bigger and better weapons to help their boss defeat rivals. Pain boys develop new surgical techniques to keep valuable fighters alive through increasingly horrific injuries. Weird boys find new ways to channel the psychic energy of the mass of Orks into devastating attacks. All of this innovation happens because Orks are competing not just against external enemies but against each other. There is also a cultural element to this internal conflict. For Orks, fighting is not just a means to an end. It is recreation. It is social bonding. It is how they establish relationships and hierarchies. Two Orks who regularly fight each other might be fierce rivals or best friends, and often the distinction does not matter. The fight itself is what is important, not the grudges or alliances it creates. An Ork who never fought would not just be weak, they would be incomplete, failing to fulfill their fundamental nature. This creates situations that would be incomprehensible to other species. An Ork can fight another Ork to the point of near death over some minor slight, and then hours later be fighting alongside that same Ork against a common enemy with no trace of animosity. Humans would see this as inconsistency or lack of principle. Our Orks see it as perfectly natural. The fight was good, they both enjoyed it. Now there is another fight to be had against someone else. Why would previous conflicts matter? Some Ork tribes have made internal conflict a central part of their culture. The Goths, for instance, regularly hold what they call crumpin contests, where their best fighters bash each other senseless to determine who is the toughest. These are not duels to the death or formal challenges. They are recreational violence, orcs having fun by beating each other up. And paradoxically, these contests make the Goths stronger as a clan, because they ensure their fighters are constantly tested and hardened through combat. The Blood Axes, often considered the most un-orky of the clans because of their willingness to retreat and use tactics, and have their own internal conflicts based on different definitions of what makes a proper orc. The more traditional clans see the Blood Axes as cowardly and treacherous, while the Blood Axes see the other clans as stupid and wasteful. This leads to interclan violence that serves no strategic purpose, but fulfills the orcs' need for conflict. What is truly fascinating about this internal fighting is how quickly it can switch off when a good external enemy appears. A tribe of orcs in the middle of a civil war will drop everything if someone shows up offering a better fight. Entire campaigns of internal conflict have been abandoned because rumors reach the orcs of a proper scrap happening elsewhere. The fighting resumes after the external threat is dealt with, or sometimes it does not, as sometimes the shared experience of fighting together against worthy opponents is enough to unite previously warring factions, at least for a while. This is why the orcs have never been truly defeated despite their constant internal conflicts. Because they cannot be destroyed by making them fight each other, they already do that. You cannot weaken them through division when they are always divided. And the moment you present yourself as a threat, all those internal conflicts become secondary. The tribes that were trying to kill each other yesterday will cheerfully fight together today if you give them a reason. The other races of the galaxy often misunderstand this dynamic. The Imperium sees orc internal fighting as a weakness to exploit, and it is, to a degree. But they fail to understand that this fighting is also what makes the orcs strong, what keeps them sharp, what ensures that only the best and toughest rise to positions of power. The Eldar understand better, having observed the orcs for millions of years. They know that the internal conflict is not a flaw, but a feature, an essential part of what makes the orcs what they are. If the orcs were ever to truly overcome this tendency, if they were ever to remain permanently united under a single banner, they would be unstoppable. The beast came close. Gazkul Thraka is coming closer, but the fundamental nature of orc society works against such unity. Because unity requires cooperation, requires some orcs accepting that they are not the biggest and strongest, requires suppressing the urge to challenge those above you in the hierarchy. And for most orcs, this suppression goes against everything they are. So they fight each other. They fight constantly, enthusiastically, joyfully, not because they hate each other, but because fighting is what they do. It is their purpose, their pleasure, their reason for being. The orcs' greatest enemy is themselves, not because they are self-destructive, but because they are perfectly designed to fight anything and everything, including each other. It is a paradox that saves the galaxy from total orc domination, while ensuring that the orcs themselves never lack for a good scrap. And in the end, that might be exactly how they prefer it. The shadow that cannot corrupt, chaos and the orcs. In a galaxy where chaos corrupts everything it touches, where even the mightiest heroes can fall to the whispered promises of the dark gods, well, the orcs stand as a curious exception. They should be perfect targets for chaos corruption. They are violent, they revel in bloodshed, they pursue excess in their own crude way, they change and adapt constantly, they spread disease and destruction wherever they go. Each of these traits should make them susceptible to one or more of the chaos gods. And yet, for the most part, the orcs resist chaos in ways that even the most faithful servants of the Emperor cannot. Chaos, as a force in the galaxy, operates through corruption and temptation. The chaos gods and their demonic servants offer power in exchange for service, promise victory in exchange for devotion, whisper of pleasures or knowledge or strength beyond mortal comprehension. These whispers find purchase in the souls of those who feel lacking, who desire something they do not have, who can be tempted by promises of more. And herein lies the fundamental problem with corrupting orcs. They do not want anything chaos offers because they already have everything they want. Consider Horn, the blood god, deity of war and slaughter and rage. On the surface, every orc should be a natural Horn worshipper. They love violence, they live for battle, they take skulls and trophies from fallen enemies. But Horn worship requires a specific mindset, a particular kind of rage and hatred. Khorne's followers do not just fight, they hate. They kill out of anger, out of fury, out of a burning need to destroy everything that is not themselves. Orcs do not hate their enemies in this way. They fight because fighting is fun, because it is what they do, because the next scrap is always waiting. An orc might crush your skull, but not because they hate you. Just because you were there and crushing skulls is a good time. This fundamental difference makes orcs poor candidates for Khorne worship. They feed the blood god through their violence, certainly. All that bloodshed and combat creates the kind of emotional energy that chaos gods feed on. But they do not give Khorne what he most desires: devoted worshippers who kill in his name, who dedicate their souls to his service, who rage against the universe with focused hatred. The orcs rage, yes, but it is a joyful rage, an enthusiastic rage, the rage of warriors who love what they do rather than hate what they fight. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, should similarly have an easy time with orcs, given their constant adaptation and change. But Tzeentch deals in manipulation, in complex schemes, bathe in the kind of long-term planning that requires forethought and subtlety. The orc approach to change is simpler. Try something. If it works, keep doing it. If it does not work, try something else. There is no grand plan, no manipulation, no scheme within schemes, just direct action and immediate response. An orc mech boy might spend years tinkering with a weapon, constantly modifying and improving it, but not because of any master plan, just because they think it might work better if it had more Daka. Nurgle, the plague god, offers immortality through decay, power through disease, acceptance through corruption. His message is essentially one of giving up the struggle, accepting the inevitable, finding peace in the cycle of death and rebirth. Orcs are about as far from this philosophy as it is possible to get. They do not fear death, and so they do not need Nurgle's immortality. They regenerate naturally, so disease holds no terror, and they are so fundamentally opposed to giving up or accepting anything that the whole concept of Nurgle's philosophy bounces off them like bullets off their thick skulls. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, trades in excess and sensation, in the pursuit of experience beyond normal limits. Every sensation amplified, every experience taken to extremes. The problem is, orcs already live at maximum intensity all the time. Every fight is the best fight. Every explosion is amazing. Every moment of combat is pure joy. They do not need to be tempted into excess, because they exist in a state of constant excess already. Slaanesh has nothing to offer them that they do not already have, beyond the philosophical incompatibility. Thus there is a structural reason the orcs resist chaos, their gods. Gork and Mork, the twin deities of the orc race, are themselves warp entities of considerable power. The exact relationship between Gork and Mork and the chaos gods is unclear, but what is certain is that the orcs' collective belief in their gods creates a psychic barrier that chaos struggles to penetrate. Every orc believes in Gork and Mork. That belief, multiplied by billions or trillions of orcs across the galaxy, generates enormous psychic power that flows to these twin gods rather than to the chaos pantheon. The saying goes that Gork is brutal but cunning, while Mork is cunning but brutal. Or possibly it is the other way around. Orcs disagree on this point and often fight about it, but the distinction does not really matter. What matters is that Gork and Mork represent everything an orc values: strength, fighting prowess, a certain rough cleverness in battle. They are not demanding gods. They do not require complex rituals or strict worship. They just want their boys to go out and crump things, which is exactly what the Orks want to do anyway. It is a perfect symbiotic relationship where God and worshipper want the same thing and get it through the same actions. This divine protection is not absolute. There have been cases of chaos-corrupted Orks, though they are rare and usually short-lived. Small groups of Orks isolated from larger populations can sometimes be corrupted by chaos if exposed to its influence for long enough. These chaos Orks typically exhibit mutations and begin worshipping chaos gods instead of Gork and Mork. But other Orks find this behavior deeply un-Orky and tend to kill corrupted Orks on sight. The corrupted ones are not just enemies, they are fundamentally wrong, violating the basic principles of what it means to be an Ork. There is also the curious case of Tuska Daemon Killer, an Ork warlord who became obsessed with fighting daemons. Tuska led his warband on raids into the Eye of Terror itself, the massive warp rift that serves as the primary domain of chaos in real space. He fought demons with such enthusiasm and success that he attracted the attention of Khorne himself. When Tuska was finally killed in battle, Khorne, impressed by the Orks' fighting spirit, resurrected him and his entire warband so they could fight in Khorne's realm forever. The Orks wake up each day in the Brass Citadel, fight demons and each other, die, and wake up the next day to do it all again. For Tuska and his boys, this is not hell, it is paradise, the ultimate never-ending battle. But Tuska's case is exceptional, and even it is not truly corruption. Tuska did not worship Khorne. He did not dedicate himself to the blood god or offer his soul in service. He just fought really well, and Khorne respected that enough to give him what amounted to an Ork's dream afterlife. The relationship was not servant to master, but warrior to worthy opponent who happens to control the arena. The conflicts between Orks and Chaos forces are relatively rare compared to their battles with the Imperium or other species, primarily because Chaos tends to exist in specific areas like the Eye of Terror or other warp rifts, while Orks are everywhere. But when they do clash, the battles have a particular character. Chaos forces often try to corrupt or manipulate their enemies, to turn them against each other or seduce them with promises of power. The Orks ignore all of this completely. A Chaos Space Marine might be trying to convert them while an Ork is bashing their head in with a chopper. The philosophy, the temptation, the whispered promises, all of it is completely wasted on warriors who already have exactly what they want and cannot be convinced they want anything else. Demons find Orks particularly frustrating opponents. Demons exist as manifestations of specific concepts and emotions, and their power is tied to those concepts. A bloodletter gains strength from rage and hatred, a daemonette from desire and sensation, a plague bearer from despair and decay. Orks do not really experience these emotions in the pure, focused form that empowers demons. Their emotions are loud and simple and unfiltered, yes, but not in ways that feed chaos properly. An Ork does not feel the kind of rage a bloodletter feeds on. They feel enthusiasm. An Ork does not feel the despair that empowers plague bearers. They feel mild annoyance at best. There have been instances of Chaos trying to take advantage of the Orks' love of fighting by simply directing them toward Chaos's enemies. If you cannot corrupt the Orks, perhaps you can just point them at someone you want destroyed and let them do what they do naturally. This sometimes works, in a limited sense. But Orks cannot be controlled or directed for long. They might attack the target Chaos indicates, or they might decide the Chaos forces themselves look like better opponents and fight them instead. Trying to use Orks as weapons is like trying to aim a hurricane. You can try, but it probably will not go the way you hope. The philosophical opposition between Chaos and the Orks is also worth considering. Chaos represents corruption, decay, the perversion of natural order into twisted mockeries. Chaos takes something and makes it wrong, turns love into obsession, courage into fanaticism, hope into despair. The Orks are not really capable of being corrupted in this way because they have no higher ideals to pervert. They are not fighting for a cause that can be twisted. They are not protecting something that can be threatened. They just fight because fighting is what they do, and there is nothing to corrupt in that simple purity of purpose. So in some ways, the Orks might be the least chaos-vulnerable race in the galaxy, more resistant even than the Tau with their weak warp presence or humanity behind its imperial faith. Because the Orks do not need to resist temptation, they genuinely do not want what chaos offers. You cannot tempt someone with power when they already feel powerful. You cannot promise victory to warriors who think they are already winning. You cannot offer pleasure to beings who find complete joy in what they are already doing. This makes the Orks a unique challenge for chaos, and in a strange way, it makes them one of chaos's true enemies, even if the two forces rarely fight directly. Because chaos wants to corrupt, wants to twist, wants to spread its influence across the galaxy, and the Orks, through simple immunity to temptation, stand as a living example that chaos can be resisted without complex faith or strict discipline, just by being too simple and too satisfied to corrupt. The galaxy is full of darkness, and chaos is the darkest shadow of all. But the green tide rolls on, untouched by corruption, uncaring of temptation, fighting their endless war for reasons that have nothing to do with the dark god's schemes. And in that simplicity, in that pure, uncorrupted love of violence, the Orks represent something chaos can never understand and can never truly defeat. The fading empire, conflicts with the Eldar. The relationship between the Orks and the Eldar is one of the galaxy's oldest ongoing conflicts, stretching back millions of years to when both races were created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven. But unlike the grand, apocalyptic battles between Orks and Imperium, or the biological nightmares of the Octarius War, the Ork-Eldar conflict in the current era is characterized by its asymmetry. The once mighty Eldar Empire has fallen, leaving behind scattered craft worlds and isolated exodite colonies. Meanwhile, the Orks proliferate across the galaxy in numbers that dwarf the remaining Eldar population. What was once a rivalry between two great powers has become a desperate fight for survival on one side and a source of occasionally challenging opponents on the other. To understand this relationship, we must look back to the time after the War in Heaven. The Old Ones had been destroyed, the Necrons had gone to sleep, and two primary races inherited the galaxy, the Eldar and the Orks, or rather the Eldar and the degraded descendants of the Krork. The Eldar, but with their sophisticated psychic powers and advanced technology, built an empire that spanned millions of worlds. They became the dominant force in the galaxy, their influence reaching into every corner of known space. They were powerful, they were ancient, and they considered themselves the rightful rulers of the galaxy. The Orks, meanwhile, had devolved from the mighty Krork into something cruder, but no less persistent. Without the Old Ones to guide them, they lost much of their sophisticated technology and organization. But they retained their fundamental nature as warriors, and they spread across the galaxy like a plague, establishing their own crude empires in the spaces between Eldar dominions. The two races clashed constantly, not in galaxy-spanning wars, but in countless smaller conflicts. As Eldar forces moved to clear Ork infestations from their territories, while Ork warbands raided Eldar colonies for the pure joy of a good fight. For millions of years, this pattern persisted. The Eldar were individually superior, their warriors more skilled, their technology more advanced, their tactics more sophisticated. But the Orks had numbers and resilience, and they could not be permanently defeated. Clear an Ork infestation from a world, and decades or centuries later, the spores would have grown into a new population ready to cause trouble again. The Eldar could win individual battles, could slaughter Orks by the thousands, but they could never truly eliminate the threat. Then came the fall. Through their own arrogance and excess, the Eldar civilization collapsed in a psychic catastrophe that literally tore a hole in reality. Their souls fed the birth of Slaanesh, the newest and youngest of the Chaos gods, and in a single moment, the vast majority of the Eldar race died screaming. Their empire shattered. Their infinite dominion ended. Those who survived did so by fleeing on massive craft worlds, artificial worlds that became entire civilizations unto themselves, or by retreating to primitive exodite colonies on the fringes of their former empire, or by fleeing into the webway to become the Dark Eldar. The Orks, characteristically, did not understand or care about the significance of these events. They just noticed that there were fewer pointy-eared gits around to fight, and more territory available for the taking. Ork empires expanded into spaces that had once been Eldar-controlled. Worlds that had known millennia of Eldar rule suddenly fell to Ork invasions. But the balance of power, which had always favored the Eldar despite the Orks' numerical superiority, shifted dramatically. In the current era of the 41st millennium, the Ork-Eldar conflict has taken on a new character. The craft world Eldar are fighting for survival, trying to preserve their dying race while seeking ways to avoid their souls being consumed by Slanesh when they die. Every Eldar life is precious, every death a tragedy that diminishes their race further. They cannot afford attrition warfare. They cannot simply throw bodies at a problem the way the Imperium can. When Craftworld Eldar fight Orks, they do so with precision, with careful planning, with an understanding that they must win decisively and with minimal losses. This has led to the Eldar becoming masters of manipulation and indirect warfare. Rather than fighting Ork hordes head-on, they maneuver them into fighting other enemies. An Eldar Farseer might have a vision of an Ork crusade that will, if unchecked, destroy an important craft world in several decades. Rather than confront the Orks directly, the Eldar might manipulate events to point that crusade toward an imperial world or a Tyranid hive fleet or even another Ork empire. They turn their enemies against each other, using the Orks' love of battle against them. The Eldar are particularly good at exploiting the Orks' weaknesses. They understand that Ork unity depends on strong leadership, so they execute surgical strikes to kill warlords and watch the subsequent power struggles tear the Ork force apart. They understand that Orks are drawn to conflict. Also, they create diversionary battles that pull Ork forces away from their true objectives. They understand the Orks' lack of long-term planning, so they manipulate events over years or decades, knowing the Orks will respond to immediate threats without considering long-term consequences. But this manipulation is a two-edged sword. The Eldar's schemes sometimes backfire spectacularly. An Ork force redirected toward an imperial world might grow massive through combat. Then, instead of being destroyed by the Imperium as the Eldar planned, defeat the imperial forces and emerge stronger than ever. An assassination that kills an Ork warlord might elevate an even more dangerous successor. The fundamental problem with trying to manipulate Orks is that they are unpredictable, driven by enthusiasm and opportunity rather than careful planning. When the Eldar do fight Orks directly, the battles showcase the stark contrast between the two races. Eldar aspect warriors, specialists who have dedicated themselves to specific martial paths, move with impossible grace and precision. Striking scorpions emerge from stealth to strike at vital targets. Howling banshees charge with screams that paralyze their enemies. Fire dragons burn through armor with weapons of terrible heat. Each aspect warrior is worth dozens of Ork boys in terms of skill and effectiveness, but the Orks compensate for their lack of skill with sheer numbers and resilience. For every Ork an Eldar warrior kills, there are 10 more behind them. The Eldar must fight perfectly, must execute their plan flawlessly, must achieve their objectives and withdraw before they are overwhelmed. The Orks can afford mistakes, can take casualties, can simply keep coming until the Eldar are forced to retreat or be annihilated. There are exceptions, of course. Some Ork war bosses have achieved legendary status among the Eldar, becoming specific threats that craft worlds track and attempt to eliminate. And some Eldar warriors have become renowned among the Orks as particularly good fights, enemies worth seeking out for the challenge they represent. These personal conflicts add a layer of individual drama to the broader species-level war. The Exodite Eldar, those who return to a primitive lifestyle on isolated worlds, often have more direct conflicts with the Orks. Without the mobility and resources of the craft worlds, Exodite colonies must defend their territories directly when Ork raids occur. These battles are fierce and desperate, whilst the Exodites fighting not just for victory but for the very survival of their way of life. An Exodite world that falls to Orks is gone forever, its population killed or scattered, its ecosystem destroyed by the Ork presence. The Dark Eldar, twisted cousins of the craft world Eldar, who dwell in the nightmare city of Komorrach, have their own relationship with the Orks. For the Dark Eldar, Orks are valuable commodities. They can be captured and sold as slaves or gladiators. Their resilience makes them perfect subjects for the Dark Eldar's cruel experiments, and their lack of sophisticated defenses makes them easy targets for raids. Dark Eldar will strike at Ork settlements, capture as many greenskins as they can carry, and disappear back into the webway before the Orks can mount an effective response. But even the Dark Eldar must be cautious. Capture too many Orks from the same area, and you might attract the attention of a war boss looking for revenge. Fail to kill every Ork in a raided settlement, and the survivors will tell tales of the pointy-eared gits who fight sneaky, making the Dark Eldar future targets for Ork warbands seeking a proper scrap with a tricky enemy. In the grand scheme of galactic conflict, the Ork-Eldar war is no longer one of the major struggles. The Eldar are too diminished, too scattered, to present a significant threat to the Ork race as a whole, and the Orks have bigger, more numerous, more entertaining enemies to fight. But on a local level, the conflict continues as it has for millions of years. Craft worlds maneuver to avoid or deflect Ork threats. Exodite worlds prepare defenses against potential raids. Dark Eldar launch expeditions to capture valuable Ork specimens. And the Orks, for their part, see the Eldar as annoying enemies who fight sneaky but sometimes provide a decent scrap. They do not hate the Eldar, do not seek their extinction, do not particularly care about the Eldar's millennia-long decline. They just fight them when the opportunity arises and move on when it does not. This might be the saddest aspect of the Ork-Eldar conflict from the Eldar perspective. Once, they were the dominant power fighting to control a rising threat. Now they are a dying race, fighting for survival against an enemy that barely notices them as significant. The Orks, who once had to struggle against Eldar might, now overwhelm Eldar positions through sheer numbers. The elegant craft worlds, once symbols of Eldar supremacy, now flee from Ork crusades they cannot hope to defeat in direct battle. Yet the Eldar endure, as they have endured for millions of years. They adapt, they plan, they use their advantages of foresight and mobility to avoid or deflect threats they cannot defeat. And somewhere in the infinite circuits of the craft worlds, the infinity circuits where Eldar souls reside after death, ancient spirits remember when the Orks were called Krork, when both races fought together against the Necrons, when the future seemed limitless and the Eldar Empire eternal. Those days are gone. The Empire has fallen. But the war continues, smaller now, less significant in the grand scheme of things, but no less fierce for those involved. The Eldar fight for survival. The Orks fight for a good scrap, and the galaxy turns, indifferent to the fate of ancient powers and rising threats alike. The prophet of war, Gazkul, Thraka's vision. Among all the Ork warlords who have ever lived, none has come closer to uniting the entire race than Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. Known to the Imperium as the Beast of Armageddon, to his fellow Orks as the Prophet of Gork and Mork, Gazkul is not just another big, tough Ork. He is something more, something unprecedented, something that keeps Imperial strategists awake at night contemplating nightmare scenarios. Understanding Gazkul is essential to understanding the current state of the Ork threat and the question of who the Orks truly fight against. Gazkul's rise to power began, as so many Ork stories do, with violence. He was once just another orc boy, serving under warboss Dregmek on the frozen world of Urk. As there was nothing particularly special about him, just another green-skinned warrior in a universe full of them. Then came the battle that changed everything. A bolter shell, fired by an enemy whose identity has been lost to history, struck Gazkul in the head, taking away roughly 30% of his skull. This should have been the end of Gazkul's story. Plenty of orcs have died from less severe wounds, but the body was discovered by Mad Doc Grotznik, one of the most infamous and least reputable pain boys in orc society. Grotznik, seeing an opportunity to try out new techniques, implanted an adamantium plate in Gazkul's skull, performed various other surgeries, and somehow kept the orc alive through procedures that would have killed almost anyone else. When Gazkul awoke from Grotznik's table, he was changed. As the injury to his brain, or perhaps something Grotznik did during surgery, or possibly the will of Gork and Mork themselves, had fundamentally altered who Gazkul was. He began experiencing visions, messages from the orc gods showing him a galaxy united under orc rule, endless war spreading across the stars, the greatest crusade the universe had ever seen. And Gazkul believed these visions with absolute conviction. More than that, he gained abilities that most orcs do not possess. Strategic thinking that went beyond the typical orc approach of hit them until they stop moving. Tactical acumen that allowed him to coordinate multiple forces across vast distances. Charisma that could bring other warlords under his banner, not through strength alone, but through sheer force of personality and vision. Where Gazkul was not just stronger than other orcs, though he was certainly that. He was smarter, more capable, more dangerous in ways that transcended simple physical might. Gazkul's first move was to challenge warboss Dregmek. The duel should have been over quickly. Gazkul was still recovering from his injuries and was nowhere near Dregmek's size. But Gazkul fought with such cunning, such precise brutality, that he systematically took Dregmek apart piece by piece. Every shot Dregmek fired somehow missed. Every blow Gazkul landed struck a vital spot. The impossible happened. The smaller, wounded orc defeated the established warboss and took his position. But Gazkul did not stop there. He began uniting the other warbosses on Urk, not through simple combat, but through a combination of fighting prowess, his strategic marriages of convenience, and his visions of future glory. He presented himself as the prophet of Gork and Mork, the chosen one who would lead the orcs to their destiny. And crucially, he convinced other warbosses that following him would lead to the best fights they had ever had. The timing of Gazkul's rise was fortuitous. Urk's sun was dying, expanding into a red giant that would eventually consume the planet. The orcs needed to leave, and Gazkul provided both the reason and the means. When a massive space hulk appeared in system, Gazkul declared it a sign from the gods and led the united orc forces of Urk in claiming it for their own. They named it Alveus Alpha, and it became the flagship of what would become one of the largest orc crusades in modern history. Gazkul's first major target was the world of Armageddon, an important hive world in Segmentum Solar, with massive industrial capacity and billions of human inhabitants. The choice was strategic in a way most orc campaigns are not. Armageddon was valuable, well defended, and close enough to Terra to ensure that its invasion would draw significant Imperial response. In other words, it was the perfect target for someone who wanted to prove themselves against the best the Imperium could offer. The Second War for Armageddon demonstrated Gazkul's capabilities as a commander. He used feints and diversions, struck at multiple targets simultaneously to divide the defenders, and coordinated his forces in ways that shocked Imperial commanders used to fighting more straightforward orc assaults. The war dragged on for months, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Eventually, massive Imperial reinforcements turned the tide, and Gazkul chose to retreat rather than be destroyed. But here is what made Gazkul different from other orc warlords. He learned from the experience. He studied what had worked and what had not. He remembered the tactics that had surprised the Imperials and the mistakes that had cost him victories, and he planned his return with the kind of long-term thinking that is almost unheard of in Orc society. 57 years later, exactly to the day, Ghazghkull returned to Armageddon. The Third War for Armageddon was everything the Second War had been, and more. Over 2,000 Orc ships entered the system, along with multiple Space Hulks, the largest Orc fleet ever assembled against a single target. The forces Ghazghkull brought included not just his own tribe, but warriors from multiple Orc empires, all united under his banner by his reputation and his vision. The Third War for Armageddon is still technically ongoing as we enter the final years of the 41st Millennium, though Ghazghkull himself has left the battlefield. And this is perhaps the most significant thing about him. He left not because he was defeated, but because his visions told him he had bigger tasks to accomplish. Armageddon was just one battle in a larger war, one planet in a galaxy full of targets. Ghazghkull's ultimate goal is nothing less than the complete unification of the Orc race and the conquest of the entire galaxy. During his time at Armageddon, Ghazghkull developed a famous rivalry with Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, as one of the Imperium's most legendary officers. The relationship between these two enemies has elements of mutual respect that are unusual in the conflicts of the 41st Millennium. When Yarrick was captured by other Orcs, Ghazghkull personally freed him and gave him a ship to escape, declaring that an enemy like Yarrick was too valuable to waste as a simple prisoner. Ghazghkull wanted to fight Yarrick properly, wanted to test himself against a worthy opponent, and you cannot do that if your opponent is sitting in a cell. This respect for worthy enemies is another trait that sets Ghazghkull apart. Most Orc warlords see enemies simply as things to be killed, obstacles to be smashed. Ghazghkull recognizes that some enemies are special, that defeating them means more than defeating others. He seeks out challenges. He looks for the toughest opponents, deliberately places himself in situations where he will be tested. This is partially because he enjoys the fight, as all Orcs do. But it is also because he believes his destiny requires him to prove himself against the best the galaxy has to offer. After leaving Armageddon, Ghazghkull's travels took him to the Octarius sector, where the war between Orcs and Tyranids was reaching a crescendo. He spent time there organizing the Orc forces, turning their scattered resistance into a more coordinated defense, proving that he could lead even Orcs who were not originally part of his crusade. Then he left again, assembling a fleet of 5 million warships, a force so vast that its true purpose almost defies comprehension. And Ghazghkull's stated goal is to defeat every major Orc warlord in the galaxy and bring them under his banner, to unite the entire Orc race for the first time since the War in Heaven, perhaps for the first time ever, and then to lead this unified force in what he calls the Great War Call, a conflict so massive that Gork and Mork themselves will tear their way out of the warp to join the fighting. This is not hyperbole or simple Orc bragging. Ghazghkull genuinely believes this, has dedicated his existence to achieving it, and has demonstrated the capability to make real progress toward this seemingly impossible goal. The question of what happens if Ghazghkull succeeds terrifies Imperial strategists and should terrify everyone else as well. A truly united Orc race, all fighting under a single banner, led by a warlord of Ghazghkull's intelligence and tactical ability, represents an existential threat to every other species in the galaxy. The Imperium, already stretched thin fighting on countless fronts, could not withstand the full might of the Orc race focused into a single assault. The Tyranids, for all their adaptability, would face an enemy that grows stronger through combat, just as they do. Even the Necrons, with their advanced technology, would struggle against the sheer numbers and psychic power of a fully unified Orc force. But there are obstacles to Ghazghkull's vision beyond the simple challenge of defeating every other Orc warlord. The fundamental nature of Orc society works against permanent unity. Orcs fight each other, not because of some flaw in their character, but because it is what they are. convincing them to stop fighting amongst themselves, to maintain unity even after all external threats have been dealt with, requires changing something essential about what it means to be an orc. And despite all his abilities, despite his visions and his victories, it is not clear that even Ghazghkull can achieve that. There is also the question of mortality. Ghazghkull has survived wounds that would kill almost any other being, has come back from what should have been certain death multiple times. But he is not immortal. He was beheaded by space wolf Ragnar Blackmane in a battle that should have ended his story permanently. Instead, through the intervention of Mad Doc Grotznik and some unclear combination of orc resilience and divine intervention, he survived even that. His head was reattached, his body rebuilt, and he continues his crusade. But how many times can even a prophet of the orc gods cheat death? And what happens to his grand vision if he falls before achieving unity? These questions hover over Ghazghkull's story, like a shadow. He is the greatest threat the orcs have ever posed to galactic civilization, the closest thing to a beast the current era has seen, possibly the most dangerous orc who has ever lived. But he is also just one being, subject to the same vulnerabilities as anyone else, dependent on his own abilities to hold together an alliance of fundamentally fractious warriors. His success is not guaranteed. His vision might fail. The great unification might never occur. But until that failure occurs, if it ever does, Ghazghkull Thraka represents the terrifying possibility of what the orcs could become. Not just a series of scattered threats to be managed and contained, but a unified force capable of drowning the galaxy in green violence. He is the nightmare scenario, the worst-case outcome, the enemy that keeps Imperial High Command planning for disasters they pray will never occur. And somewhere, right now, Ghazghkull is traveling the galaxy, his fleet of millions seeking out the next warlord to defeat, the next war to fight, the next step on his path to fulfilling the visions Gork and Mork have shown him. His enemies multiply with each victory, as every species that could potentially oppose a united orc force becomes invested in his failure. But his strength grows too, as more and more orcs hear tales of the prophet and his victories and join his great crusade. Our Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is proof that the orcs can be more than simple barbarians, more than crude warriors who fight without thought or planning. He demonstrates that given the right leader with the right vision, the orcs can be strategic, coordinated, genuinely threatening in ways beyond simple, overwhelming force. And that realization, that understanding of what the orcs could be, makes him perhaps the most dangerous enemy, not just to the Imperium, but to every species that is not green-skinned and armed with crude weapons that function through belief and violence. The prophet of war marches on, and the galaxy trembles at his approach. The true enemy within, unity, purpose, and destiny. We have explored the orcs' many enemies, the ancient Necrons they were designed to fight, the Imperium they battle most frequently, as the Tyranids who mirror their biological adaptation, themselves as their most constant opponents, chaos which cannot corrupt them, and the fading Eldar who once matched them in power. We have examined Ghazghkull Thraka's vision of ultimate unity and conquest. But to truly understand who the orcs fight against, we must look deeper, beyond simple military conflicts and species-level rivalries, to the fundamental paradoxes and contradictions that define the orc race itself. The question, who are the true enemies of the orcs, has been answered in multiple ways throughout this exploration. But perhaps the most honest answer is the most unexpected. The orcs have no true enemies because they need no enemies. They fight because fighting is their purpose, their pleasure, their reason for existence. The identity of the opponent matters far less than the quality of the fight itself. An orc would be just as happy fighting a Necron, a human, a Tyranid, or another orc, as long as the scrap is good. This leads to a profound realization. The greatest threat to the orcs might not be any external enemy, but the potential loss of conflict itself. What would orcs do in a galaxy at peace? What would become of a species designed solely for war if war somehow ended? The question is almost meaningless because the Orks would never allow such a state to persist. If all external enemies were somehow defeated, the Orks would simply fight each other until new enemies emerged, or old ones regenerated, or the whole cycle began again. But there is another, more insidious threat to the Orks, as one that comes not from the possibility of peace, but from the possibility of perfect unity. If Ghazghkull or another warlord were to truly unite all Orks under a single banner, if they were to eliminate the internal conflicts that keep Ork society in constant flux, something fundamental would change. The Orks would lose the very thing that makes them what they are: the endless competition, the constant fighting, the tribal rivalries that ensure only the strongest and most capable rise to power. Consider what happened during the War of the Beast. The Beast united the Orks to an unprecedented degree, coordinating multiple tribes and empires into a coherent force that nearly destroyed the Imperium. It was one of the most successful Ork campaigns in history. But when the Beast was killed, that unity collapsed immediately. But the Orks went back to fighting amongst themselves, their great crusade fragmenting into tribal warfare. From an external perspective, this was the Imperium's salvation. But from the Orks' perspective, it was a return to normalcy. The Great Crusade was fun while it lasted, but so is a good tribal scrap. This pattern suggests something important about Ork nature. They are not designed for sustained unity. Their society, their psychology, their entire biological makeup pushes them toward constant conflict at every level. Unity is an aberration, a temporary state that can be achieved under exceptional circumstances but cannot be maintained indefinitely. The Orks are designed to fight everyone, including and especially themselves. It is not a flaw, but a feature, an essential part of what makes them the galaxy's most successful warrior race. Yes, but what if this feature could be overridden? What if a leader emerged who could not just unite the Orks temporarily, but keep them united permanently? Such a leader would need to be more than just the biggest and strongest. They would need to provide something that satisfies the Orks' need for conflict while maintaining their loyalty and preventing internal warfare. They would need to be, essentially, a god-made flesh, a being so transcendent that all Orks would follow without question. Ghazghkull Thraka might be on the path to becoming such a being. His visions, his victories, his apparent divine mandate all point towards something unprecedented. But even Ghazghkull faces the fundamental problem of Ork nature. If he defeats all external enemies, if he unites all Orks, if he achieves total victory, what then? The Orks under his command will need to fight something. If there are no external enemies left, they will fight each other. And if they fight each other, the unity collapses. Ghazghkull's grand vision contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Unless, of course, the war never ends. And here we come to the terrible genius of Ghazghkull's plan, as related in his visions. He does not want to win and then stop fighting. He wants to create a war so vast, so all-encompassing, that it literally never ends. A conflict involving every Ork in the galaxy fighting every other species simultaneously, with the Ork gods themselves joining the battle. In such a war, there would always be enemies to fight, always new challenges to overcome, always the next scrap on the horizon. The Orks would be united not by eliminating conflict, but by directing all conflict outward. This vision reveals the true nature of the Ork threat and the true nature of the Orks themselves. They are not trying to conquer the galaxy in any traditional sense. They are not building an empire that will last for millennia. They are not seeking dominion or control or any goal beyond the continuation of conflict itself. The Orks want a galaxy at war because they are war. They exist to fight, and fighting requires enemies, and therefore enemies must always exist. From this perspective, every species in the galaxy is both the Orks' enemy and the Orks' reason for existence. The Imperium, the Tyranids, the Necrons, all of them are necessary for the Orks to fulfill their purpose. Without enemies to fight, the Orks would have no purpose. But they are parasitic on conflict, dependent on the existence of other species to provide opponents, even as they threaten those species with extinction. But here is the paradox. The Orks can never truly destroy their enemies because doing so would eliminate their reason for being. An Ork crusade that actually succeeded in killing every member of another species would face an existential crisis. What do you do when you have won completely and permanently? For most species, this would be cause for celebration. For Orks, it would be the beginning of a crisis. The solution, of course, is to never truly win, to always have more enemies, to ensure the war continues forever. This might explain why Ork crusades, even successful ones, tend to be self-limiting. An Ork force will conquer a planet, fight all the good fights, loot everything worth looting, and then move on to the next target without consolidating their gains or establishing permanent control. They are not interested in empire building. They are interested in the next battle. The conquered world will either fall back under the control of its original inhabitants once the Orks leave, or it will become a breeding ground for new Orks, who will eventually form their own tribes and fight amongst themselves until a new warlord unites them for another crusade. This pattern ensures that the Orks always have enemies to fight. They create their own opposition through their very way of life. Every Ork victory sows the seeds of future conflicts. Every conquered world becomes a source of new Ork populations who will eventually need to fight someone. The cycle is self-sustaining and potentially eternal. Understanding this helps explain why the Orks are so dangerous and yet have never actually conquered the galaxy, despite having the numbers and resilience to potentially do so. They are not trying to conquer in any meaningful sense. They are trying to fight. Conquest is just a byproduct of warfare, not a goal unto itself. The Orks are the galaxy's most successful warrior race, precisely because they have no higher ambitions than warfare itself. This brings us back to our original question. Who are the true enemies of the Orks? The answer is everyone and no one. Everyone is an enemy because everyone can be fought. No one is a true enemy because the Orks do not hate anyone enough to seek their permanent destruction. Even their conflicts with themselves are not rooted in genuine animosity, but in the need for combat that defines their existence. If we must identify a true enemy of the Orks, it might be peace itself. Not the abstract concept of peace that the Orks would never understand or care about, but the practical absence of conflict. A galaxy where there was nothing to fight would be hell for an Ork, more terrible than any demon-haunted warp rift or any tyrannid hive ship, because the Orks are not fighting for survival or for glory or for any higher purpose. They are fighting because that is what they are. Remove the ability to fight, and you remove their reason for existing. But such a scenario is impossible, precisely because the Orks exist. As long as there are Orks in the galaxy, there will be conflict. They ensure it through their very nature. That they are a guarantee against the possibility of peace, a living embodiment of war itself given green skin and crude weapons, and sent forth to ensure the galaxy never knows rest. From a certain perspective, this makes the Orks the galaxy's greatest curse. They prevent any lasting peace, any true resolution to the endless conflicts that consume countless lives across billions of worlds. From another perspective, the Orks are simply being true to their nature, fulfilling the purpose for which they were designed millions of years ago when the Old Ones needed warriors to fight the Necrons. They are weapons that have outlived their creators and their original purpose, but continue functioning because that is what weapons do. The tragedy, if one can call it that, is that the Orks themselves do not see any of this as tragedy. Though they do not mourn their lack of higher purpose. They do not wish for peace or rest or anything beyond the next fight. They are content, in their crude way, happy even, living exactly the life they were designed to live. While other species struggle with questions of meaning and purpose, while they build civilizations and cultures and grand projects to give their existence significance, the Orks simply fight and find that fighting is enough. In the end, the Orks' true enemy might be the very concept of purpose itself, Because if they ever stopped to question why they fight, if they ever considered whether there might be more to existence than constant warfare, they would cease to be orcs. They would become something else, something that contradicts their fundamental nature. The orcs persist as they are because they never ask why. They simply fight, and in fighting, they are complete. Conclusion: an endless war for an endless people. We have journeyed through the myriad conflicts that define the orc race, examining their battles with ancient Necrons and modern Imperials, their biological mirror match against Tyranids, their internal struggles with themselves, their resistance to chaos corruption, and their declining conflicts with the Eldar. We have explored the vision of WH40K and contemplated the deeper questions of purpose and unity that shape the orc experience. Now, as we reach the end of this exploration, we must synthesize what we have learned and consider what it means for the future of the galaxy. The orcs are, in many ways, the most successful species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They outnumber nearly every other sentient race. They occupy territories across the entire galaxy. They have survived for millions of years through catastrophes that destroyed civilizations far more advanced than they are. They persist through sheer resilience and adaptability, through a biological design so robust that it borders on the absurd. And all of this success comes from a simple fact: the orcs know exactly what they are and never deviate from that nature. Other species struggle with questions of purpose and meaning. The Imperium fights for the survival of humanity and the preservation of the Emperor's vision. The Eldar fight to avoid extinction and the predations of Slaanesh. The Tyranids fight because they are hungry, a biological imperative they cannot ignore. But the orcs fight because fighting is fun. That is their entire philosophy, their complete motivation, but their ultimate goal. And in the grim darkness of the far future, this simplicity is a profound strength. Every enemy we have examined presents a different challenge to the orcs, threatens them in different ways. The Necrons have the technology and durability to match orc resilience. The Imperium has the numbers and organization to sometimes contain orc expansion. The Tyranids present an evolutionary arms race where both sides grow stronger through conflict. Other orcs ensure that the green tide never achieves lasting unity. Chaos offers temptations that, while mostly ineffective, occasionally corrupt isolated orc populations. The Eldar manipulate and maneuver to avoid direct confrontation while steering orc forces toward their enemies. But none of these enemies threatens the orcs' existence as a species. What the orcs cannot be permanently destroyed, because their biology ensures their persistence. They cannot be corrupted because they genuinely do not want what chaos offers. They cannot be outnumbered because they reproduce through spores faster than any enemy can kill them. They cannot be manipulated for long because they are too simple and direct in their thinking. Every apparent weakness is balanced by an equally profound strength. This brings us to the question of what the future holds. As the 41st millennium draws to a close and new threats emerge from the darkness, as the Great Rift tears reality apart and ancient evils awaken, as WH40K gathers his great crusade, the orc threat grows more dire with each passing year, but it also remains fundamentally the same. Yet the orcs of today are not substantially different from the orcs of 10,000 years ago or the Krork of 60 million years ago. They fight, they spread, they cause chaos wherever they go. The details change, but the pattern persists. If you have enjoyed this deep exploration into the enemies of the orcs in Warhammer 40,000, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth lore discussions about the grim darkness of the far future. Like this video if you found it informative, and share it with fellow enthusiasts of the hobby. Your support helps us create more content, exploring the rich and detailed universe of Warhammer. The galaxy turns, uncaring of the struggles of its inhabitants. Wars rage across 1 million worlds. Species rise and fall. But through it all, the orcs endure. While they were here before most current civilizations existed, They will be here long after many of those civilizations have fallen to dust, because they are not trying to build something that will last. They are simply being what they were designed to be. The perfect warriors, fighting the perfect war, forever. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And for the Orks, there is nothing else they would want.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.